All right, we're about to tackle one of the most notoriously complex and frankly, kind of spooky rules in all of law. But don't worry, we're going to make it make sense. This is the rule against perpetuities, a legal battle against the ghostly grip of what's called the dead hand. Let's get into it.
So it really all boils down to one simple but profound question. Once you're gone, how far into the future can your will really reach? I mean, can you dictate what happens to your property for your great-great-great-grandchildren and beyond? This isn't just some philosophical puzzle. It's a legal problem that people have been wrestling with for centuries. And this brings us to that amazing term, the dead hand. It's this powerful metaphor, right? It's the idea of the deceased trying to control the living forever. If you let it go unchecked, you could have property locked up for generations, totally unusable, all based on the wishes of someone who's been gone for hundreds of years. So the law decided, yeah, we need to put a stop to that.
So, how does the law actually fight back against this ghostly control? Well, it sets a very particular kind of time limit. It's a rule designed to strike a balance between respecting someone's final wishes and, making sure society can actually function.
And this is it, the rule against perpetuities, or as law students call it, the RAP. Put simply, it's a legal expiration date on controlling your stuff from the great beyond. The whole point is to make sure that eventually property gets unlocked and can be bought, sold, and used by the living. The core mission is to promote the free alienation of property. Now, that's just a fancy legal phrase for the ability to actually sell or transfer it. Without this rule, you could have a piece of land that's been tied up by instructions from someone in the 1700s, which you can imagine isn't great for a modern economy. Okay, so how does this time limit actually work? It's not a set number of years, like 100 years and you're done. No, it's way more clever and admittedly a bit complicated. The best way to think about it is like a ticking clock that starts the moment a will or a trust goes into effect. This formula has two key parts. First, you have to identify the important people who are alive when the gift is made. These are your lives in being. Then, after the very last one of those people passes away, you add a flat 21 years on top of that. That total time, that's your limit.
Let's just break that down a bit more. The lives in being are basically your measuring stick. They're real people whose lifespans set the first part of our countdown. And that 21-year period that gets tacked on at the end, historically, that was meant to give a baby born right before their parent died enough time to grow up and legally take ownership of the property.
Now listen up, because this is the single most important part, and it's what trips everybody up. A gift or a trust is only valid if you can prove with 100% absolute certainty that it has to be finalized within that time frame. If there is even the tiniest, most bizarre 1 in a billion chance that it could finalize one day too late, the whole thing is void from the get-go.
The best way to understand this is to see it in action. So let's walk through a classic example. This is where the theory gets real, and you'll see exactly why this rule has a reputation for being so tricky.
Okay, so here's our setup. We've got testator A, who puts some property in a trust. The rule is simple. It goes to A's first grandchild to turn 21. At the time this is all set up, A is 65 and has 2 kids, B and C. Seems pretty straightforward, right?
So in this scenario, A's children, B and C, are our lives in being. They're the measuring lives. This means that our 21-year countdown clock doesn't even start until both B and C have passed away.
But here comes the twist. The law forces us to consider every single possibility, no matter how ridiculous it seems. So, what if A has another child, let's call them D, after the trust has already been created?
And this is the critical part, because this new kid, D, wasn't alive when the trust was made. They cannot be a life in being. They don't count for our clock. Only B and C do.
So here's how the crazy logic unfolds. It's possible, right, that B and C are measuring lives, both die tomorrow. Then this new afterborn child, D, could live for another, say, 50 years, have their own child, and then that grandchild eventually turns 21. See what happened? That would all take place way more than 21 years after B and C were gone.
And that's the punchline, because we found just one real, remote, theoretical scenario where the gift could be finalized outside our time limit. The entire gift is void. It fails completely, right from the very beginning. It's wild.
So, let's just sum that up. Any grandchild who came from the original kids, B or C, would have been fine. They would almost certainly turn 21 well within the time limit. But that tiny possibility of a grandchild from some theoretical afterborn child, that breaks the rule's demand for absolute certainty, and it torpedoes the whole thing.
So what's the deal with such a tricky rule today? Well, its legacy is really about this ongoing struggle to balance the wishes of the past with the needs of the future.
Yeah, because of exactly these kinds of bizarre outcomes, many states and countries have changed the rule. Some have adopted a wait-and-see approach, where you just see what actually happens. Others have just set a flat time limit, like 90 years, just to avoid all these harsh, counterintuitive results.
But even with all these modern fixes, the original rule is still so fascinating because it boils all this complexity down to one single, timeless principle. It forces us to look at a fundamental tension that exists in any society. And really, that's the question I want to leave you with. How should we balance what one person wants with what future generations might need? The rule against perpetuities was one very clever, if complicated, answer. A ticking clock designed to make sure that, in the end, the dead hand has to let go. Thanks for watching.